All right, well, welcome to the Collateral Global podcast. I'm Caitjan Gainty. I'm a historian of medicine at King's College London. And I am here today with my colleague, Daniel Hadas, who is also at King's. And this is the reversal of the previous conversation that we had where Daniel interviewed me. Now we're going the other way around. And I'm going to leave it to Daniel to say a few words about, by way of introduction, about himself.
Yes, thanks. So very briefly, I am a lecturer at King's College London, as Caitjan just said. I'm a lecturer in both the history and the classics departments. And my official job title is lecturer in medieval Latin. And so I, as that suggests, teach medieval Latin. I also teach ancient Greek.
Great. So actually that really works well for the very first question, which is, kind of along the lines of how does somebody like you get into thinking about things like this? And so just by way of context, my very first introduction to you, as I've told you before, was when you were inviting people to come to the Latin play that you were a part of or you were putting together. So for a long time, when I first arrived at King's, I thought of you as the Latin play guy, but never really, not in a bad way, in a very good way. But it was really amazing then to re-meet you in this context, talking about these kinds of issues. And I'm just curious, so how did you get from there to here? And then sort of more broadly, what does the humanities, I guess, do? How are the humanities relevant here? Because you're somebody sort of steeped in the humanities.
Yes, thank you. So I think that I should start by explaining briefly, because it is somewhat relevant and also it's otherwise going to be opaque, what the Latin play is. So,
yeah.
One of the things that I do as part of my job, and this is something that I inherited from the previous holder of the job, is that every year I organize for the students I teach to perform a play. And it's quite unique because the play is performed in Latin, and it's also it's a medieval Latin play or a Renaissance Latin play. So this is not a body of work that gets performed at all very often, let alone performed in the original Latin. So it's quite a special little thing. As far as I know, this is the only place in the world where this actually goes on. Now, I think that it's relevant in the sense that so the last time this actually happened was in 2019. And it was then supposed to happen again in March 2020. And it was actually, I think, 2 weeks before the performance was scheduled that we closed down our university and moved gradually into lockdown. So, I remember within 2 days going from preparing to get this play into its final stages to realizing this wasn't going to happen. And this was very sad. So, this was sort of a particularly enthusiastic group of students who were very keen on doing this play. They had been sort of really hyped up. I had a director who they loved, and because I should say I don't actually do anything except organize it. And so it was just going to be this beautiful little moment, hopefully. And then it was canceled. And in a sense, for me, it's representative of the sort of new framing that we got into, where something like a group of 22-year-olds putting on a play in Latin suddenly became, if you will, non-essential, became frivolous. It was utterly selfish and outrageous to suggest that something like that should go on in this context. It was, all of that had to be stopped. It had to be shelved for some indefinite period. It was no longer valuable in this context where we had to save lives. And so this kind of thing, I think at that time said, that's dumb, we should just do the play, I would have been seen as having a very monstrous view on the whole thing. So that's my way of background, and I think gets it. Now, I think that, if anyone's going to watch this, it is important to answer the question of what I, as you say, a humanities scholar and a very old-fashioned one, could possibly bring to this conversation. And I think that there are two ways of looking at that. Firstly, I would say that, in general, the COVID response is something that has involved us all as citizens, and I very much oppose the idea that it's something that should only be spoken about or thought about seriously by people with subject-specific expertise, whatever the subjects are. And there's been a very sort of strong tendency to say, okay, if you've got something in your job title like epidemiologist or public health professor, or even like if you've got the fact you've got medicine in your job title because you're a historian of medicine, is enough to say, okay, maybe this is someone we should listen to. Or maybe stretching it a bit for a sociologist or so forth. But I think that part of the idea of how a sort of open liberal society works is that everyone is invited to participate in the conversation, and then everyone is invited to evaluate what they have to say, among other things, just in terms of its actual content rather than their expertise. So that's part of it. I would then say that, I have three parts to this. So I would then say that, part of being an academic, part of being a scholar is having a methodology, a way of working in sort of gathering information, trying to think about it in an organized way, trying to put it into a logical system and sort of see the various sides of it, see what conclusions it can lead to. And that is something that we all are supposed to know how to do, whatever our subject matter. In that sense, I don't really think there's a distinction between the sciences and the humanities. That's a very Anglo-Saxon thing. In France or in Germany, people in classics, for instance, are very happy to say they're doing Wissenschaft or science as part of how they describe what they do. So, in as much as I have the sort of habits and training to do that, I think that it's transferable, and I've tried to transfer it. So I've spent a lot of time reading about this and thinking about this, and hopefully, if I'm good at reading and thinking about the things I normally work on, to some extent I can do that about something else.
I mean, it's so interesting, right? Because one of the things that sort of brings out is this idea that these very particular ways that we have of understanding expertise are as much about kind of drawing lines of distinction between people for all sorts of other kinds of purposes, as they are about, in certain instances, like the specificity of the information or the kind of stuff that goes on and the specificity of the training that you need in order to understand it. And I think it's more the former, actually. It's more the former than the latter. And one of the things that's so impressive about you is how, we have, having a conversation with you is like having a conversation pretty much with another scholar who works in this area, right? And with like a very, with a particular perspective and a particular, but I mean, I think that's so important that, in many ways, really kind of just a kind of applying yourself to the situation means that you can do a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's very kind. I mean, I should say that, I make no claims to knowing as much or having thought about it as carefully as people who have spent decades doing so.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I have probably spent an hour or two a day reading about this for 2 years, and hopefully that should get you somewhere. Now, the other thing I would say is that specifically this last part of your question about the humanities is that, one of the things that I feel very strongly is that we've had a response very heavily dominated by science, and that in effect means by scientists and sort of authorities that are appealing to the specific knowledge that science has or claims to have. And, this is very, very incomplete in terms of the ways in which one can possibly think about what a pandemic is and what to do about it. That is not just a question of let's understand this infectious disease and the immune system and indeed the sort of health system and what people could do to quote unquote protect the health system. This is a question about life and death. It's a question about how we're going to think about those things. It's also a question that I think it makes a lot of sense to put in a historical framework. This is not the first pandemic and it won't be the last. And what we're doing now necessarily is a product of history being at this historical point. And I think then it's just a sort of worthwhile human activity to think about this in terms of what have we done in the past. And so, in as much as part of what we do in the humanities is think about these questions, think about history, think about religion, think about life and death, and particularly in the sort of periods I study in antiquity and the Middle Ages, people took these problems very seriously. They thought a lot about death. They did a lot of dying. I mean, no more than now, but they're coming from a world where plagues and famines happened all the time, and where no one went through life with the expectation that they were going to live very long. And so, all of this, I think, is part of what needed to be thought about, needed to be part of the conversation. And so, I'm just one guy. I very much wish and hope that more people in the humanities, whether as academics or as musicians or writers and poets and so forth, I wish that they had been brought in from the beginning. I hope that they will, as this conversation goes on.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. Of course, that I totally agree. And I think it's also, it's also interesting because we have had this tendency, just as you say, to think that this is a science problem and that's all it is. But really, without kind of consideration of all of these other kinds of, it makes for a very impoverished view of what science and medicine are really all about if you delete these parts that are really very much, out of the humanities. And so adding that back in, I think, can only be a very good thing.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think, the ideal you want is beyond specific expertise. It has to be limited. You do want to break down this barrier in the sense that, someone who is, quote unquote, in the humanities should be conversant with the discourse of science and vice versa.
And vice versa,
And just briefly, I think part of what we've seen is that, I think we'll probably touch on this more, but in fact, the idea that the response was science-led and we were just doing science things was false in the specific sense that the scientists and science-adjacent people who were leading the response inevitably wound up implicitly and sometimes explicitly taking positions on these larger social and moral and spiritual questions because you have to.
Because you have to, right? And it's an interesting thing. I mean, maybe we should jump ahead to the question that we had that focuses particularly on that. But it's sort of this problem of thinking of science as something that can be pure and objective and separate and abstract, rather than something that is, as I think most would say it is, something that is very much a part of the world, very much influenced by what happens in the world, by politics and culture and all of these other, and individuals and all that kind of stuff. And that, kind of pretending that that isn't the case has never served us well. And I think particularly here, what tends to happen is that if it looks like that science is being sort of tainted by culture or politics or whatever, suddenly it's tainted science, right? Rather than being just, this is actually the way that science functions, which changes the whole kind of conversation that we end up having around these kinds of issues. Maybe we'll come back to that one. But there's a question I really have been wanting to ask you because it touches really specifically on work that I've been doing about sort of radical health movements in the mid 20th century in particular. So one of my favorite figures of the radical movements at mid 20th century was the peripatetic critic and former priest Ivan Illich, who I think is really a fascinating person and has a really rich view of medicine and health. But one of the critiques that was put to Illich over his lifetime, but especially after his death, when sort of evaluating his significance, is that his anti-establishment radicalism, which took the form of things like the mainstream healthcare system is broken, doesn't work, actually causes more illness than it relieves, that came very close in many ways to the kinds of critiques that were being produced on the other side, sort of the ultra-conservative critiques of medicine. And there are glimmers of that in our own contemporary around COVID. And we've had lots of conversations where we've talked about sort of the critiques that come out of thinking with COVID about medicine and science and things like that. But we've never really touched on this question of, well, what happens when, what does it mean, or what's the significance of these two kind of critiques sort of coming together? Does it mean that they are one and the same critique, or is it a kind of, just a kind of strange, odd bedfellows kind of situation? Or how do you make sense of that? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, thanks. So Ivan Illich, I mean, unlike you, I don't know him well, although I've been delving a bit in those waters of late, and he increasingly seems like somebody who we very much need to read more of at the moment. Somebody who sort of, as it were, could have seen this coming much more than an innocent like me. As a Catholic, I should say you never stop being a priest. So
yes, my dad was a priest actually.
Oh, is that
never
so?
Stopped being a priest. So there you go. Yes. Anyway, yes.
Anyway, I think that to put a little context on this, there's a very specific thing that's happened with the COVID response and politics, at least in this country and in the US, which is that we saw a very strong alignment of what I would call the institutional left with the COVID response we actually had. So the response, which I think can be summarized as lockdown till vaccine. And this was the institutional left in the broadest sense possible. So both left-wing parties and then the sort of tenured radicals of academia and left-wing press and so forth, that they were all sort of on a spectrum of alignment with this. And then to a lesser extent, you had the sort of institutional right, in some cases pushing very hard against it, and in other cases just being a bit more sort of ho-hum about it. But the basic tendency was for the left to say we should do more of this, and the right to say maybe we should do a bit less. And you then have this sort of group of people who would traditionally identify more or less as on the left, who somehow didn't go along with this embrace of the lockdown till vaccine response. And I know quite a few of these people, and who felt very bewildered, more than any other specific group. They've just felt like, what has happened? How is this a left-wing policy? And certainly, I probably historically identify less as being on the left than some of my friends and colleagues in this space. But nonetheless, I had this sort of vague leftism of academics. You subtract my Catholicism, I was a Guardian reader and so forth. And so I certainly partook of this reaction and of this shock. And, part of what was then sort of difficult in terms of one's allegiances was to say, wait, suddenly I seem to be agreeing with all these people that I've kind of been trained not to agree with ever.
Right.
These libertarians, aren't they evil? And just Brexiteers or whatever it might be. And so that takes us to the heart of your question is, how do we look at this? Do we say this is just a sort of odd moment where the streams have crossed, but there's not much to make of it? Or do we say, do we need a rethink? And I very much tend towards the second answer. I've had similar experiences in my sort of interaction with radical feminism in this sort of whole transgender question,
Yeah.
whereas, I'm coming from this basically Catholic perspective and saying, wait, something's wrong here, and then the group that one finds is also saying this very strongly is this radical feminist group. And, and you can say, well, actually, we still have to hate each other because radical feminists hate traditional Catholics and vice versa. Or you can say, actually, it would be interesting to see why are we aligning?
Yeah.
What could be fertile here? And I think something very similar applies here. That, ideally, you would want both people who are traditionally identifying as sort of libertarian right and people who are sort of traditionally identifying as leftists of various sorts to take notice of this fact that they've suddenly reached not just related, but really the same position.
Yep.
And think, what's going on here? And I don't have a simple answer to that, but it seems to me that part of this does have to do with authoritarianism. And that, part of what's happened to the sort of radical or vaguely radical left is that they have, gained a lot of institutional power, and through whether it's being elected or just being promoted, and you're then in this sort of paradoxical position where in theory your whole sort of raison d'etre has to do with being anti-authoritarian, because authorities are the bad guys, and yet you are the authorities. And so you have to resolve that. And I think sort of a lot of the standard response on the left was to say, the way we're going to maintain that paradox under COVID is to say, these lockdown measures are great, but they're not being done intensely enough. We're still protesting against the man because we're saying, you should do a proper lockdown and you should really properly solve this. But you then have other voices who are sort of more loyal to what I would see as a more genuine suspicion of authority or desire to put limits on what state authority and what power can do. And that really is a shared position with the part of the right that has libertarian is supposed to be a bad word, but that has a ingrained commitment to setting limits on authority. And so, I think that's sort of a starting point where these two sides can think together.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about it in terms of authority. Do you think that's the overriding kind of, where it's kind of the area of critique where the kind of, I don't know how to put this in a good way, but sort of where you're coming from? Do you think that's sort of the...
No, I think it's authority is a bit of a vague word, and obviously we need authority in this world, so, I'm not a sort of anarchist. This can all be solved. But, I think I would try and say something a bit more specific, which is that there's this phenomenon where the sort of forms of authority that have become dominant, at least in the West, to a large extent have taken on this very dehumanizing character. So the sort of tendency to see populations as numbers, as pieces in a problem that needs to be solved. And we have this whole sort of vast apparatus of dehumanizing, empty language in which our authorities, including us, we all sort of play into this in as much as we all are part of the bureaucracy and deal with the bureaucracy, in which they sort of address us, and it's ugly both in its expression and in a lot of what lies behind it. And so, it's not just this question of saying sort of down with the man, but of saying that, we want to live in more human, less artificial ways. And that, I think, is sort of a model like that is really where maybe this common ground can be found and expressed and built upon.
I think what's interesting about a lot of the kinds of things that you've written and others have written sort of in this similar vein is that there is this, in certain cases, there is this kind of sense that, okay, this is about kind of arbitrary decision making and kind of authoritarianism and all that kind of stuff. But there's also kind of a strain of this, which I find fascinating and really useful about just kind of pointing out the illogic of a lot of the decisions that are made. So illogic, by the terms of the logic that's set out for science and medicine and politics, but also illogic in just a kind of more commonsensical sort of way. And I think there's also that component of it, which I think, to some degree separates out the kinds of critiques, one kind of critique from another kind of critique. Where, this one critique is sort of what academics do all the time, what humanities academics do all the time, like looking back and saying like, wait a second, this is sort of, this doesn't really follow, even though you've sort of forced it to follow in this particular context. So what's up with that, right? As opposed to, well, this is clearly done for authoritarian reasons and therefore I'm against it, right? Which is a different kind of critique. And I think, maybe your, I don't know what your allegiances are exactly, but certainly a lot of what you've said has been about pointing out these illogics in an interesting, and useful kind of way.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that all of these things are separate angles, as it were. I mean, I don't, I take the authoritarian critique seriously, and I do think it's, in sort of political terms, that's an obvious place for common ground. But there's also this sense that, one place where people in general should be able to find common ground is the area of rational thought. And as you say, one could sort of sit all day listing things that we've done to quote unquote solve COVID or stop COVID that, even on the very narrow terms of saying we have to reduce COVID transmission, which are the most narrow terms you can set, they demonstrably don't work. They don't make any sense. And, so there's a sense in which, and it's worse than that because it's the combination. So, that people do things that don't make logical sense. That's just part of how we live.
Right.
But it's the combination of saying we're going to do this and sort of putting this whole sort of social and almost spiritual energy behind it. And then the only way in which you justify that is in terms of this language of rationality and science. So, like in the Middle Ages, if you have a plague, you have a procession and you get out the icons and you say lots of rosaries and, and then like if you're going to talk to an evidence-based medicine person, they will say, wait a second, let's do a randomized trial of processions and plagues and see if they make the processions go away. And, and then this sort of the medieval person says, no, that's not how this works. We don't think in those terms. And you just have a clash of cultures and, you have to make your choice. But when we're doing something like, just to pick a random example, putting up plastic barriers at every shop in the land, it's not presented as we're doing this to appease the angry gods. It's presented as this is a science-based approach. And, we're doing it because science and, ideally, common ground can be found in merely stopping and saying, wait a second, does this actually work? Why are we doing this? What is the plastic barrier evidence and so forth? And I mean, I think that's the level of critique that is, for me, baseline. And that, hopefully that conversation can be had with anybody. And, like obviously, as I say, none of us are entirely rational creatures, but it is, a place where common ground can hopefully be found beyond politics, if you will.
I mean, and I think that's such an interesting thing to think about. I mean, has your view changed over, so now you've done all this reading, science and medicine, history, but also just contemporary sort of COVID-specific kinds of things. Has your view of science and medicine, the role of science and medicine, the logics of science and medicine changed as a result of sort of doing all this work?
Yes, I mean, definitely. So, I mean, one of the things that strikes me about this is that, one change is just that I've developed much stronger views. So, I mean, a sort of background to this is that, beyond being someone who's, works in a specific field, I, like many academics and just people in general, have always been a big general reader and a big consumer of sort of middle to highbrow mainstream publications.
Yeah.
So, I was a reader of the New York Times and the Guardian and the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker for many, many years. Quite a religious reader, so to speak, of these sorts of publications.
Mm-hmm. But not TV, though.
But no, not TV. I don't have a TV, although of course I watch stuff on YouTube. And so, this kind of, like, part of the point of this kind of publication is to tell you what you should be thinking about as a sort of alert, sensible person who's trying to, understand the world and the arts and politics and so forth. And what's striking to me is how little of that kind of thinking person's entertainment was devoted specifically to science and medicine, and particularly, if you will, to the sort of social role of science and medicine, the historical role of science and medicine. I mean, you had some sort of very egregious things like the opioid crisis that got a certain amount of coverage, but there was, I think, like a big gap between the importance of science and medicine in our lives and the amount to which we were sort of stimulated to think about this within this mainstream space. And I mean, so like you would have sort of coverage of science in the sense of, here's an astrophysicist who's going to tell you something about black holes. Aren't black holes cool? But that's more sort of textbook stuff than social stuff. And I mean, like, to pick an example, I would say that, if I had read even half or a third as much over the last 15 years about medicine and society as I've read about Islamic terrorism, I would have been much more prepared to see this sudden invasion of science and medicine in our daily lives. Whereas Islamic terrorism, in fact, thank God, has affected me very little, other than in as much as it's been this huge media storm that we've all been told we have to think about all the time. So that's the background. So I would say that the two things that sort of I've learned that I think hold up, that seem to be most important, are, and sort of more specifically about medicine. And the first is the level of crisis in medical research and then the application of research in terms of treatments and drugs. So, obviously any field of research and science and scholarship is going to be imperfect, but, in our sort of quiet world of the humanities, we kind of bump along at a level of reasonable competence. We're mostly mediocre most of the time, but, if you open an average sort of prestige or respectable historical journal and read an article, you expect the author to actually know what she's talking about and that the sources she's quoting say the things that she says they quote, and she's done sort of the relevant literature, relevant reading. Whereas it is, I think, the case in medical research and in its rollout that none of these things are anywhere near guaranteed. That, there's just, every level of the process that, it is the things that happen on a daily basis, if you will, are that results are firstly faked, and then when they're not faked, they are overhyped or misinterpreted, and then when we come to publication, the peer review process doesn't work at all, so things that should not be published because the results are fake or because they've been overhyped get published, the peers put them through, and then when we get to the rollout, this will actually lead to treatments and drugs being authorized and sold and taken. So this is not to say this is always what happens, but that it happens on a completely alarming scale. And I don't feel this is something that I was very aware of, and it feels like it's now something that I am much more aware of. And the sort of, a statement like, Richard Smith, the former editor of the BMJ, makes, where he says, all published medical results should be treated as false until proven otherwise. Like 3 years ago, that would have been absolutely astounding to me that that's where we're at. Whereas now that seems to me probably the right starting point. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, this is more sort of the Illich point, is that, I've become increasingly conscious that we need to think about, it's something I think you've probably thought about for decades, but the sort of very heavily level of medicalization of our entire societies, the extent to which we are sort of encouraged and expected to live our whole lives as patients. We're born in the hospital, we die in the hospital, and we spend a lot of time in between under treatment. Some vast proportion of adults are taking drugs every day, and just a sort of constant resorting to medicine to solve problems. Because by the grace of God, I've personally always been healthy. Mostly, I haven't been so conscious of that, but it seems to me this is a huge part of the picture of how we actually live, and sort of crucial to understanding how a medical emergency was allowed or pushed to take over the entirety of society for a year and a half.
I mean, I think that's so interesting. I mean, there's like this, from my own personal experience, having always been healthy until at some point it was deemed that I was at risk for something, right? But once you're at risk, that then becomes pretty much the same thing in a way as having whatever that thing is, to a greater or lesser degree. And it was so profound to me at the time, because it's something I always talked about and thought about, this kind of medicalization, what that actually looks like, what are the details and the nuances of it, because it's not as if doctors just say, now you are my patient, and patients, say, I will look for my doctor, but instead this much more kind of complicated set of, cultural, social, political, medical factors. But it was really stunning to me when I was, it was decided that I was at risk. What a transformation that actually felt like, even, even though I was somebody who is very aware that these are the things that happen all the time, I suddenly felt as though I was fundamentally in a different class of people. And that's such a kind of an interesting, way of, a kind of an interesting kind of visceral experience of exactly how medical our world is in this fundamental way. And it isn't to say, I think there's the kind of basic assumption is that you should say that that's a very bad thing, but there's also the kind of more basic question, well, is that a bad thing? Or how did that happen? Why are we in this kind of situation? I mean, because in some ways you might say well, there's no doubt that, medicalizing in certain ways, or at least this was the belief of sort of these, kind of early century practitioners, that this is going to make everybody healthier and it's going to make people live longer and all that kind of stuff, preventive medicine and whatever. But then there's the kind of Illich kind of narrative, which is really, this is absolutely the worst thing that can be. And sort of at the center of it is these really fundamental questions about what is a good life? Like, what does a good life entail? Is it about longevity, or is it about quality, or is it about, and those are the kinds of things that we don't take up and think about, even though I think, that's why the humanities belong here, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and I think we'll probably wind up saying more about longevity, but that, even when you get critiques of medicalization, and I mean, not perhaps so much from Illich, but because nobody sits up and says medicalization is great, hooray for that. It's always a question of either we don't talk about it, or when we do, we sort of scratch our chins and say, how did that happen? I mean, obviously there are people who make a lot of money from it, and they tend to be not such fierce critics. But that, as long as you're sort of conceiving of health almost in the abstract, or as health as merely sort sort of the absence of disease, the maximum of bodily well-being, then the conversation is just going to really be, well, what's actually healthier, taking this drug or not taking it?
Yeah.
And what you really need is, as you said, this sort of much broader conversation about what constitutes a good life.
Yeah.
What role does the absence of disease actually, the always temporary absence of disease, play in that?
I mean, and the next question is really about sort of along these same lines, like what you've learned about the way science works, and really interesting to hear you talk about sort of the replication crisis, and the realization, which is not widespread at all, of how I think Richard Smith is great for this kind of thing, like pointing out all of the ways in which medicine doesn't actually do what you think it does, or these kinds of things, like that. The revelation by this kind of pharmaceutical company guy in the early 2000s saying that like 90% of drugs, I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong, but for dramatic effect, 90% of drugs work only in 30% of people, right? So it's this real question about like all the faith that we've put into science and medicine, and the kind of, what's interesting about that is less the statistic and more the kind of relationship it implies about and the trust that we have in a particular way of understanding what science does. And one of the things that you wrote about actually that sort of takes this apart is the famous Structure of Scientific Revolutions, the Thomas Kuhn book, which really is one of these books that describes the way in which science actually works in a really revelatory sort of way, I think, for a lot of people. And so one of the ways that you describe it in your article, but correct me if I'm wrong, but is this kind of idea that we start with this state of no knowledge, and then we explore ways of knowing that fit or that work, and we use that to establish new knowledge, but that is not a way of saying that new knowledge has now answered the question officially. Instead, it is always a stepping stone to some other new knowledge that either challenges or confirms or does some other work around these kinds of things. And I mean, I think that's a really nice way of thinking about the work that science does, and much more productive because it really emphasizes this kind of in-process nature. But I think there's also this interesting thing that it brings to light, which is that if we know that that's true, right? If we know that science is a way to make new knowledge, not a way to kind of pluck it out fully formed from the air and say, here it is, now we know. So it kind of brings up this question, like, so why shouldn't we do things like lockdowns? Why shouldn't we wear masks? Why shouldn't we do those kinds of things? Because if the science says at that moment that that's sort of the right thing to do, and that's the knowledge we have, how can we not sort of work with that knowledge, even if later on it turns out that that knowledge is not right or is not exactly what we said? And so this this kind of brought up from me this question of what Trish Greenhalgh has sort of talked about when she said initially we should wear masks. We don't know, and we may never know how effective they are, but we should wear them anyway because the risks are minimal and the benefits are potentially quite high. And isn't that enough of a reason to do something like this? And so I'm just really interested in your thoughts on this, because there is this kind of tension on the one hand between understanding science is process, and that nothing that happens is going to be 100% absolutely firmly right. And on the other hand, though, kind of moving against the kind of authoritarianism, not even authoritarianism, but moving against that as the right thing to do in a circumstance where everything is basically unknowable. And I'm sort of two minds about. I'm really interested to hear what's your response to that.
So I should probably go into a bit more detail about Kuhn just to put this in context. Although the main thing to do is obviously read the book. So I mean, what Kuhn really challenges is there's sort of this vision of science that I think we'll talk about more as we go on, but which is generally described, I think, as positivist. Where the basic idea is we just keep on getting more truth, and science is sort of, the way it's supposed to work is this monodirectional progress, this sort of building this ever bigger structure of truth. And so, for instance, most of us, as we grew up, were sort of taught like this sort of basics history of science, that once upon a time people believed that God created the world in 7 days and made everybody out of mud. And then that got a bit more sophisticated, and then eventually Darwin comes along, and we learn that that is not true, and something else is true,
right.
And that there's the evolution of species and the survival of the fittest, and that's how it actually all worked. And so science has made progress. Now, Kuhn's position is very extreme in opposition to that. So what he says is that there isn't any kind of progress on some objective linear scale in science. Science works within a paradigm or a model, which is a sort of self-contained thought system, and the only progress that happens is within that thought system. So you say, this is our sort of basic truths. So, your medieval person says, well, what we do know is that the Bible is reliable, and then we're going to build on that, and we'll get as far as we can within the Bible as our base text. Darwin says, no, what really matters is the fossil record, and then we build on that. And Kuhn says you can't say that one system is better than the other than that it's more intellectually fertile, that it's more productive. Scientists are, if you will, just getting more out of it. Mm-hmm. And that really is his position. He was attacked for it at the time. When he writes a sort of clarifying afterward in the republication, he's just doubles down and says, that is absolutely what I think. Now, I'm not signed up to that in the sense that, I think you can say God did not create the world in 7 days, 7,000 years ago. Much as I think that, it's dumb to then dismiss those ways of thinking as merely dead and invalid. But I think that nonetheless, Kuhn's basic insight that you're working within a paradigm is very important, that there is no sort of the science that doesn't have any presuppositions, that just, as you say, plucks everything out of the air and establishes the facts. And so if we make this, now we sort of turn back towards COVID and making concrete, let's talk about masking, because that you mentioned Trish Greenhoff, and masking was, and I think still is, her big thing.
Yeah.
And, there's been a very strong tendency by those who critique masking to say, the evidence just isn't there. And, we sort of distinguish between population-wide trials and lab trials and say, your lab shows that it stops X amount of virons, but if we actually look at the studies, we'll see that the population-wide randomized control studies, they don't show any effect, and so on and so forth. And I don't have a problem with those critiques. I think that they stand up on their own terms, and we'll talk a bit more about masking later. But what I think they fail to see is that you're sort of dialoguing with another group of scientists who have simply moved on to the position where they are certain that masking works in theory, and that if it's not showing effectiveness, you're just not doing it right. Or even, you don't have to do trials or tests about this. This is one of the things that we have as a certainty. And in itself, that's not invalid in the sense that science, as a practice, cannot question everything all the time. Mm-hmm. So you have to set some certainties and say, okay, this is one of our fixed points, and then we're going to question other things. And it's also the case that it's valid to say that we're never going to get 100% certainty about anything. And, yes, the studies don't look good for masking, but, it's not definitive. Things aren't definitive in a question like this. And it may be that if you do another 1,000 studies, you'll be able to find some where masking will work. And, part of, what you find when people study things again and again is they'll pretty much get all the results under the sun in due course.
Right.
people study extrasensory perception and find that works. If you do enough randomized trials, you'll get everything.
Yeah.
So what I would then say is that the way, I think the way sort of out of this impasse is to try and broaden the question. So, if we're just going to discuss whether masks work, if we mean, do they stop or reduce the prevention of COVID, there's this whole other question you're not asking, which in the specific case is basically, do we want to live in a masked world? Mm-hmm. Do we want to do that for a few weeks? Do we want to do that for a few years? Do we want to do that permanently? Mm-hmm. Since infectious diseases are always going to be there. And, that is a question that I think it's ultimately absurd to say is beyond the remit of science. If science is going to go around telling us we all have to wear masks.
Yeah. But it is beyond the paradigm of science, right? I mean, if we've adopted science as our paradigm, right, that's the way in which we understand the world, and it's the way in which we validate the things that we do in it. That kind of question, you're asking us to shift the paradigm potentially. Is that right?
I think that's right, but I think that in a sense it's, there's really no way out of that because this question is not being treated in the abstract. It's the scientists who promoted and continue to promote masking aren't sitting on the sidelines saying, for your information, masking is effective in preventing the transmission of diseases. They're immediately making the leap from there to saying this is something that we should do as, a country or a school district or whatever it might be. And you can't both make recommendations for how we should live and say the question of how we should live is beyond the remit of science. So,
but you can say, like, within the remit of science, this is the, this is the answer to the question that I would like to put forward. But there are other, ways in which to answer this question, right? I suppose, like, I think the thing for me is to ask whether you feel like, maybe sort of blowing up things from this question or from what you're saying. Is it that we should, allow for the legitimacy of other paradigms to enter into our decision making, or is it that because one of the problems you might say, based on what you're saying, is that even though Kuhn in many ways is not necessarily always the best example to draw out for people who have thought about science in an interesting sort of way, but putting it in his terms because they're sort of easy. So thinking in terms of these paradigms, right? Does science need to appropriate more of other, kinds of ways of thinking in order to be more effective and representative and sort of useful? Or do we need to kind of tone down our commitments to science as the thing that makes truth in our world right now?
So I think that, it has to be one of the two things or possibly both. I don't think that what we're doing at the moment is going to be sustainable without doing a lot of more damage in the relationship between science and society. So I guess that, you could look at it one of two ways. You could either say what science needs to do is acknowledge, if you will, the social, sort of more broadly human implications of which paradigm it chooses, if we're deciding which variables we're going to hold fixed and which ones we're going to be allowed to move around, then everything can't be up for grabs all the time. Or, just to take a sort of slightly grotesque example, but, there's this thing that happens in some countries where you decide that very small children have attention deficit disorder syndrome and start giving them drugs. And, in a sort of everything is up for grabs world, you can theoretically say, why not until we've done trials to work out whether this is true? But it seems to me this is sort of a road to insanity, and you have to say, well, one of the things we do not do is give toddlers mind-altering drugs. Our paradigm does not allow that.
Yeah.
And science is a social practice, and it needs to take place in a context where we're not destroying ourselves. And I think to some extent that just has to happen, because the language of pure objectivity is too false for it to be maintained. Mm-hmm. But I also think that that's not going to happen overnight, and there's a parallel need for the sort of non-scientific parts of our world to say, okay, we need to see that this isn't a question where science, at least as currently practiced, mm-hmm. is going to get us very far, and we need to assert our right to use other paradigms, to say, in the case of masking, maybe you've convinced yourselves and got good evidence that it does this one thing, but there are other things that we want to do in the way we live that are equally or more valid than whatever you are now defining as what science says we should do. Mm.
So one of the things that I've really been wanting to ask you about concerns something that, an article that you linked to in an article you wrote called After COVID, which is about how masks don't stop transmission, and written by John Tierney. So I'm just going to read a little quote from it. By the time the mandates were introduced in New York and other states in the spring of 2020, infections had already been declining in those states, and the mandates didn't prevent a surge later that year, when cases rose and fell in nearly identical trajectories regardless of states' mask policies. And that was so striking to me, because you see, especially sort of in the 50s and 60s, you see all sorts of medical people, sort of radical critiques of medicine, say exactly that. And there's sort of one of my favorite examples is this immunologist, Thomas McGill, who writes this whole article that tears up the very basis of the way that people have understood vaccinations and other kinds of interventions like that, by showing a series of graphs and charts and things that show throughout history these moments when we've kind of assumed that, he uses pneumonia as one of his examples, we assume that the vaccination changes everything, changes the whole scope, and that what should happen really is that cases are like this and then it goes like that, right? Or ideally that's what you would see. Instead, he says the same thing, right? You still see the same kind of pneumonia was already declining before the vaccine came into effect. And so the very least that you can say is, or in his view, the very most that you can say is that, well, these two things were sort of around the same time, but they are not necessarily, related to each other. It isn't the case that you can say that the vaccine then changes things fundamentally. And I've always been really interested in this, and I've never really gotten my head around what actually happens to these kinds of critiques sort of historically. They're pretty well, they're well represented at the time, and nobody's saying that's, you're joking, that's ridiculous, you've got it totally wrong. But I don't know what happened sort of subsequently, so I'm always sort of unclear on that. But it's not a critique that really stuck, certainly. And I'm just wondering, why do you think that is? What is it about this kind of critique that, it feels like this kind of recurring theme that this doesn't actually work, and nevertheless we put all this emphasis on it anyway? What do you make of that? Yeah,
obviously it's a great question. I think one that's very relevant to what we've been through and are still going through to some extent, as I say in my article. I don't, as ever, I don't have some miracle answer to it. I had two thoughts. One is a quite simple one that, the whole history of medicine is largely a history of failures, with some stunning successes, but, as far back as we can trace medicine, we can see an enormous amount of attempt to solve illnesses that are not very effective, and yet that we keep doing. And part of that is just because we want to solve illnesses. Part of that is, it's just very hard for us to acknowledge how difficult medicine is, how little understanding we have of of biology. I mean, we know more than we used to, but we're just chock-a-block of questions we can't answer very well. And nature abhors a vacuum, and so does science. So there's a tendency, particularly when something looks plausible, to assume it works. And I mean, I think with vaccines, because some of them work so well, there's a sort of embrace of the whole thing as a solution. And there's this huge plausibility that masks are going to stop respiratory viruses. It sort of instinctively makes sense, in the same way that something like the fear of the humorous instinctively made sense to people when they believed in it. And things like that get purchase. The other thing I think, and I'd be very interested to know what you make of this, but is that there's a tendency that's probably become more and more pronounced within medicine to specialize, and that means to narrow down an overall problem into bits, and then to say what we're going to do is sort of not address the overall health of the individual, or even more the overall health of a community, but yes, that's the overall aim, but you as a practicing physician or researcher are solving problem X. Mm-hmm. And that makes things simpler because you're only looking at the one problem, and then it sort of incentivizes you even more to find a simple solution. So in a way, when I think about masks and COVID, I think that, what is the question masks are supposed to answer? And what we're saying is the question we're answering is, how do you stop, or at least dramatically lower the probability of person X passing on the virus to person Y? And that is the specific problem we're trying to solve. Mm-hmm. How do I, Daniel, not pass on COVID to you, Caitjan? Mm-hmm. And then, there aren't a million even possible solutions. Basically, either I just stay away from you, mm-hmm. or, okay, so that's actually not going to be possible. I can't be locked in a room for the rest of my life. So the next thing we're going to have is, well, maybe we should sit 6 feet apart from each other, or, okay, we can't maybe do that all the time, so what else is there? I guess there's masks. Mm-hmm. And so because you've fixated or fixed your attention on this specific problem, you're going to have to be oriented towards other solutions. And what you're not doing is saying, wait a second, why are we actually trying to stop person X passing on COVID to person Y? And I think if we ask that question, mm-hmm. we get somewhere much further for two reasons. Firstly, because it was very evident from very early on that COVID was going to be a pandemic and then become an endemic virus. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, everyone was going to pass it on to somebody, and everyone was going to get it. And so it's much less obvious in that sense that this is a name that makes any sense whatsoever. And, basically, yes, we want to be healthy, but getting COVID at some point is going to be part of how our life is going to be. And, is it really a reasonable view of our overall health to say one of your health priorities has to be not passing it on, not getting the specific disease, that ultimately you are going to get whatever you do. Mm-hmm. And then, secondly, and a bit more almost technically, the reality of what we mean when we say this disease is going to be a pandemic and become endemic is that it's going to come in waves. And the first waves are going to be very big because there seems to be no or very little natural immunity. Possibly there's some cross immunity from other coronaviruses, but clearly a very large proportion of the population is susceptible. And then these waves are going to normalize into smaller waves as the disease becomes endemic. So the immune proportion of the population in any given COVID season is what it is. It's there, and so now everyone gets it all at once. And then seasonality also plays a role. So no one's going to get all at once, even in the first wave. And that's the only possible end game for this. And the only way in reality that a given wave is going to go down is if the virus transmits. So in that sort of population health sense, mm-hmm. the idea that we should all try and make sure that as few people as possible could get COVID is ultimately a dead end. because, you're solving the wrong problem, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, what's so interesting about that, and I think we talked about this the last time, is that actually, another way of kind of reorienting this question is to say, actually the need to kind of reduce transmission or keep is not about this question of like what's going to happen, in the end for us health-wise or whatever, but instead is about this question of how do we protect our infrastructure in a really fundamental way. So then the goal of reducing transmission or slowing transmission is much more conceivably, and the goal of medicine or public health in this case, much more conceivably is about this goal of, preventing an overflow of patients in the NHS. And that's a goal of medicine that we have to take seriously, which is a nice kind of, well, I think it opens up the way that we understand what medicine and public health are really about in productive and important ways, and also creates this space of, well, if that's what the goals are of this, then what about these issues that you're raising about kind of the end game for us as humans and in terms of our health, right? That's in some ways exactly not the question that these things are addressed to answer. And you've, which I think you've, really clearly sort of laid out, which I think is really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you wind up with this, completely paradoxical position where you're basically saying we have to make everybody unhealthy in order to protect the health system.
Yeah.
Because, you cannot basically not harm the overall well-being of the population by instigating these huge-scale lockdowns. Saying, and we're seeing this play out in very practical terms, particularly in this country where, we protect the health system.
Yeah.
And now it's collapsing because of the things we did, among other reasons, because of the things we did to protect it.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's this really interesting story. I mean, I think, and it kind of raises this more practical question, which is really the question I want to end on, which is, well, what should we have done? I mean, because you can, we've talked throughout this kind of about the different logics that sort of are at work in all of these discussions. Political logics, cultural logics, scientific logics, etc. And it really raises this question, like, well, what was the right thing to do, or what practically what could we have done? Isn't all of this just sort of like, tossing things out and seeing what happens? Like, is there something more than that?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, as usual, I have a bipartite answer to that. So, I mean, I think the first answer is that, what we should have done, in as much as we are supposed to live in sort of democratic and sort of citizen-governed societies, countries, is that we should have had a response that was, firstly, which reposed on this sort of what I would see as the two fundamental pillars of the way these societies are supposed to work. One of which is a sort of creation of consensus across society, rather than a fairly sort of top-down and also very heavily propagandized response. And the other is that we have things that are sort of inalterable, that are rules that you don't get to just suspend because a bad thing has happened. So, I always just see it as extraordinary that suddenly we reached a stage where the list of things that could be legislated about included leaving your house or seeing your brother, and like these areas that no one had even thought had to be protected by legislation because they were, so fundamentally obviously rights. So that's that in itself isn't an answer to what we should have done, but I think if we had started by saying, firstly, we need to try and, even within this short time, have dialogue and build consensus. And secondly, we can't say everything's on the table, we can do anything that is possible, that we would have been in a much better place. I think, for instance, we would have been in a place much closer to a country like Sweden, which, like most critiques of the response in the UK and the US, I tend to see the Swedish response is much better. We would have done something more like the focused protection that some members of Collateral Global have very strongly espoused. Now, within that, if we were having that social conversation 2 years ago, and I knew now what I knew then, what I know now, as it were. I personally would probably have advocated for a very minimalist response, and just to justify that, I think in two ways. Firstly, it seems to me that once you sort of open the box of saying we need to solve COVID, we need to somehow make it do as little harm as possible. We need to, whatever that means, ensure as few people as possible get COVID, or people getting COVID is delayed for the 18 months it's going to take to make a vaccine, or we're going to select who gets COVID, or all these sort of things that you open, then you immediately enter this paradigm where you're saying, we want to achieve these results, and the results are important. And then if, doing X doesn't work, then you don't really have any reason to say, okay, we can't go any farther. So we're going to say, well, all we're going to do is, testing in nursing homes. Well, that doesn't seem to be enough. So now we're going to also close shops, and then we're going to close schools, and then, and then, and then. And because you've said this is what we want to achieve, you don't really have any way of saying, no, that's a step too far.
Yeah.
So because you've opened Pandora's box, if you will.
Yeah.
And you don't, how can you say, well, we shouldn't close schools because it's bad for kids? It's like, well, maybe, but we've set ourselves this aim of stopping COVID, so are we no longer trying to do that? And so you're sort of into this. So to put it another way, I think it's very hard to actually think of measures that are likely to have more than minimal effect, that don't have then this extremely strong knock-on effects on the other side. And then the other way I would put it is that if we sort of narrow it down to what might be a focused protection strategy, and try and think of that in sort of terms of an individual. If you're, let's say that you're talking to a friend or a relative who is in this at-risk group, and you're saying to her, well, the news is that COVID is happening and you are at risk, but we're going to try and protect you. So what that means, well, basically we have this idea that's possible that we can develop a vaccine that will mean you will be much less risk once you get this vaccine. But with the best will in the world, COVID came to the UK last week, and there isn't going to be a vaccine for a year at best, probably a bit longer. We can't just cook them up in the kitchen. So we're going to have to keep you safe for a year. And so what does that actually mean? Well, does it mean that your friend who's in her 70s is going to have to spend a year in isolation? Does it mean that she's going to, require everyone who ever meets with her to take a lateral flow test in the morning? And you've sort of opened this door to this very strange way of living for this person.
Yeah.
Now, it's a free country. I'm not saying that people, this should be banned or people shouldn't be allowed to choose that. But I think that once you start messaging that this is sort of a hugely acceptable option, you're saying to people, the choice that we're very strongly encouraging you to make is this one of sort of living in this hermetic state for this long period. And I don't think I would want to live that way. I don't think that in some sort of truly meaningful sense of healthy, that is a good way to live. I think that, yes, sort of living as you did before is going to involve higher risk, a higher confrontation with mortality. A confrontation with mortality isn't ultimately escapable in life. So, basically I would say, see your grandchildren, live your life. And, at the very least, I would say in terms of the response, that should never have been taken off the table as part of what we left open to people and said, God bless you, that is a reasonable and honorable choice.
I mean, it's been so amazing talking to you about this, because I think you've kind of offered us a whole new set of questions, a whole new way of thinking about these things, a whole new paradigm potentially, which I think is really useful. So I'll just thank you so much for sharing your insights about all of this.
Well, not at all. Thank you so much. It was wonderful talking to you too.